The controversy over accumulation, profits, and demand in the early 19th century represents one of the foundational moments in the development of political economy. At its core was a deceptively simple but explosive question: can a capitalist economy produce too much? In the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, Britain entered a prolonged period of economic distress marked by unemployment, falling prices, idle capital, and social unrest. Warehouses were full, yet laborers lacked work and income. The historical context transformed what might otherwise have been an abstract theoretical disagreement into a high-stakes intellectual confrontation. David Ricardo and Thomas Robert Malthus stood at the center of this debate, and their disagreement over accumulation and the possibility of general gluts became one of the defining controversies of classical economics. The dispute was not merely about technical theory, it concerned the inner logic of capitalism, the role of landlords, the function of demand, and the long term trajectory of economic growth. Ricardo's framework begins from a highly structured and deductive model of distribution. In his Principle of Political Economy and Taxation, he constructs a system in which the total output of society is divided among three classes: landlords, workers, and capitalists. Rent accrues to landowners as a differential surplus arising from variations in land fertility. Wages are determined by the subsistence requirements of labor, largely dictated by the cost of food, and profits are the residual share that remains after wages are paid. Ricardo's great insight is that profits and wages more move inversely. If the price of food rises because cultivation extends to inferior land, workers must be paid higher wages to maintain subsistence, and profits fall accordingly. In this formulation, the long-term rate of profit declines not because of insufficient demand but because of diminishing returns in agriculture. Accumulation continues as long as profits remain sufficient to incentivize reinvestment. When profits are compressed by rising wages, capital accumulation slows and the economy approaches what Ricardo calls the stationary state. Within this structure, accumulation is not a threat but the engine of progress. Profits are reinvested into productive capital, expanding the scale of industry and increasing output. The process is cumulative. Higher profits lead to more investment, more employment, and greater production. Ricardo doesn't deny that crises may occur, but he insists that there can be no general glut of commodities in the aggregate. His reasoning follows from what later became to be known as Say's law. Production generates income equal to value of output, and that income constitutes demand. If good remains unsold, it is because production is misdirected among sectors, not because of aggregate demand is deficient. There may be too many hats and too few shoes, but there cannot be too many goods in total. The problem in Ricardo's views lies in the structure of production and distribution, not in systematic shortage of purchasing power. Malthus challenges his conclusion directly. In his Principles of Political Economy and in his extensive correspondence with Ricardo, he argues that accumulation can indeed outrun demand. Capitalists, driven by the desire to save and reinvest, may expand production beyond what consumers are willing or able to purchase at a profit. Workers confined to subsistence wages cannot absorb the surplus output. If capitalists reinvest all profits and reduce consumption in favor of savings, who will buy the goods? Malthus introduces the concept of effective demand, emphasizing that mere existence of supply doesn't guarantee corresponding expenditure. For him, the possibility of a general glut is real and historically observable. The post-war depression in Britain and with its combination of falling prices and widespread unemployment served as empirical evidence that production could exceed demand. The disagreement hinges on fundamentally different concepts of economic equilibrium. Ricardo assumes that markets clear through price adjustments and that savings are automatically translated into investments. For him, the act of saving is not a withdrawal of demand but a direction of purchasing power towards capital formation. Malthus, by contrast, sees saving as potentially contractionary if it is not matched by investments. If capitalists withhold consumption but investment opportunities are limited or unprofitable, the result is a deficiency of demand and a decline in profits. In this view, accumulation can become self defeating. Excessive thrift can depress prices, reduce profits, and discourage further investments, thereby generating a downward spiral. Malthus's solution is provocative. He argues that unproductive consumption, particularly by landlords and clergy and the state, plays a stabilizing role. Expenditure on luxury goods, public works, and other forms of non-productive consumptions help sustain demand and prevent overproduction. What Ricardo regards as parasite expenditure, Malthus sees as necessary ballast for the system. This divergence reflects deeper normative differences. Ricardo's model privileges productive investment and views rent as a drag on accumulation. Malthus assigns a positive function to the spending of landlords and other non-capitalist consumers. In effect, Malthus anticipates a line of reasoning that would appear in Keynesian economics more than a century later. Aggregate demand matters and economics can stagnate due to insufficient expenditure. Ricardo's response is consistent with his broader distributional analysis. He acknowledges that accumulation may temporarily overshoot, but he denies that this can be a permanent condition. If profits fall, capitalists will reduce investment until equilibrium is restored. The system contains its own corrective mechanisms. For Ricardo, the most serious long-term threat is not insufficient demand but rising wages driven by increasing food costs. The ultimate regulator of profit is the productivity of the marginal land in cultivation. As population grows and inferior land is brought under production, the cost of subsistence rises, wages increase, and profits decline. This process continues until profits fall to a level at which accumulation ceases. The stationary state emerges from structural constraints, not from cyclical demand failures. Technological change complicates this picture. Ricardo reorganizes the improvements in machinery and agricultural techniques can temporarily offset diminishing returns. By reducing the cost of food and other goods, innovation lowers wages in terms of money and sustains profits. However, he treats technological progress as an episodic counterforce rather than a permanent solution. In later editions of his work, particularly in the chapter on machinery added in 1821, he revises his earlier optimism and admits that mechanization can harm laborers by displacing employment. The introduction of machinery alters the composition of capital, increasing the proportion invested in fixed assets relative to wages. The shift has implications for profits and employment that Ricardo only partially integrates into his system. The accumulation debate thus intersects with emerging concerns about industrialization. As mechanization accelerates, the classical assumption of a relatively stable capital labor ratio becomes untenable. If machinery replaces labor and the source of surplus shifts, the dynamics of profit change accordingly. Ricardo doesn't fully theorize these implications, but his analysis provides the foundation for later thinkers. Karl Marx, in particular, draws heavily on Ricardo's labor theory of value and his concepts of profit as a residual share. Marx transforms Ricardo's neutral distributional categories into a theory of exploitation. For Marx, surplus value arises from unpaid labor, and technological change increases the organic composition of capital, leading to a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. What Ricardo treats as a natural limit imposed by land scarcity, Marx interprets as a systematic contradiction inherent in capital production. The historic dimension of Ricardo Malthus controversy cannot be overstated. The economic slump following the Napoleonic Wars exposed vulnerabilities in Britain's industrial economy. Falling agricultural prices, reduced military expenditure, and shifting trade patterns created widespread instability. Malthus interpreted these events as evidence of demand deficiency, while Ricardo attributed them to transitional adjustments and structural constraints. The debate anticipated later disputes between classical and Keynesian economics over a role of aggregate demand in determining output and employment. In this sense, the early 19th-century controversy laid the groundwork for modern macroeconomic theory. At a deeper level, the disagreement reflects contrasting visions of capitalism. Ricardo's system is austere and mechanistic. Distribution is governed by objective forces tied to land productivity and subsistence wages. Accumulation proceeds until constrained by diminishing return. Demand plays a passive role assumed to adjust automatically to supply. Malthus introduces uncertainty and instability into the model. Human behavior, expectations, and consumption patterns matter. Accumulation can become excessive, and saving can be destabilizing. Where Ricardo sees a self regulating mechanism tending towards equilibrium, Malthus sees a system vulnerable to imbalance. Despite the passage of 2 centuries, the themes of this debate remain relevant. Questions about overproduction, underconsumption, and the limits of accumulation created to animate economic discussions. Technological innovations have vastly expanded productive capacity, yet concerns about stagnation and insufficient demand persists. The tension between saving and spending, investment and consumption remains central to macroeconomic policies. Ricardo's emphasis on structural constraints and distributional conflict continues to form analysis of resource scarcity and income inequalities. Malthus' focus on effective demand foreshadows contemporary debates about fiscal stimulus and aggregate demand management. In conclusion, the controversy over accumulation between Ricardo and Malthus represents a foundational moment in political economy. It forced economists to confront the possibility that capitalist growth might encounter internal limits, whether through declining profitability or insufficient demand. Ricardo constructed a rigorous deductive framework in which profits fall as wages rise due to diminishing returns in agriculture. Malthus challenged this logic by emphasizing the role of demand and potential general gluts. Their debate not only shaped classical economics but also influenced later developments in Marxian and Keynesian thought. The issue they grappled with, distribution, accumulation, profitability, and demand, remain embedded in the structure of modern economic analysis.